Chapter 11. Confrontation of the Black Shadow. October 10th, the day of Naruto's 8th birthday and every birthday before that, was Memorial Day at Konoha. It was always a cold, dark and somber day, as though the skies themselves were in mourning. The sun hid itself behind its clouds, which loomed heavily and slowly over the village. The villagers, all garbed in black, gathered around the memorial marker for the fallen heroes of the day the Nine Tails attacked. Even at the academy, there was always a special history lesson to begin the day for every class. The year before, when Naruto had been in Iruka's class, the Chunin had recounted for them how the shinobi of the village had fought bravely, holding off the Nine Tails from the rest of the village as they waited for the fourth to arrive. Then, they had a moment of silence before they resumed normal class activities. But Naruto had been transferred to a new class 2 years his senior, and he found this year that his new instructor, a Chunin named Mizuki, conducted the lesson rather differently. Glossing cursorily over what the ninja had done, the man seemed to relish in describing the Nine Tails in detail. According to him, it was a colossal leviathan and each lashing tail rained destruction on the world every time it was swung. It was an uncontrollable force of nature, with fangs as long as a grown man and eyes that seethed with the burning fires of hell. The Nine Tails was a roiling, churning ball of evil, with only one intention in mind: to destroy anything and anyone in its path. A student raised his trembling hand and asked, "But the fourth killed it, right, sensei?" A murmur of uncomfortable agreement spread throughout the classroom. The students had all of course grown up hearing in their bedtime stories about the monster that had terrorized the prior generation, but they'd never had reason to fear it. Because always, at the end of every story, their mother or father had finished the story by saying, "The fourth Hokage, a hero who loved his village and who was loved by the village, was able to protect us. At the cost of his life, he defeated the Nine Tails so that the future generation, so that you, could in turn grow up to be fine shinobi and continue protecting Konoha." With a kiss to their forehead and a click as the light turned off, they had always fallen asleep with smiles on their faces and dreams of becoming the next hero to save their village. But a strange sly smile stretched across Mizuki-sensei's face as he heard the student's question. "Well," he said, "the fourth certainly dealt with it for us. And that is why he is today a hero." The Chunin bowed his head downwards in a show of respect, and all the students automatically copied his gesture. However, just before Naruto obediently complied, Mizuki tilted his head and glanced in his direction. And for a moment, Naruto thought that the Chunin's eyes had lingered on him with a cold glint. But an instant later Mizuki's gaze moved on to look fondly over the students. After a moment's hesitation, Naruto thought it more likely the fault of his overactive paranoia. Mizuki-sensei had treated him fairly over the past year and seemed to bear no ill will against him. It wouldn't do for him to poison the opinion of his instructor when he had so little support as it was. As he lowered his head, Naruto wondered briefly what Mizuki-sensei had meant by dealt. He hadn't directly answered the student's question. Could that mean that the Nine Tails was still alive and roaming the wilderness? Naruto's head hurt at the possibility, and he instantly dismissed it. The fourth had been too great a man to have simply chased the beast away. He would have dealt with it in the best way possible for the village. And what else could that be but to kill such an untamable monster? Team Oboro, hailing from a Megakure, never even saw it coming. Their plan had been to wait to the midpoint of the exam so that the strongest teams would have finished and the weaker teams would have worn themselves out. They were still in top shape and pumped for action by then, and with their nearly perfected strategy of genjutsu and clone techniques, procuring a plate from the first exhausted Genin team, from Suna, as it were, that passed by had been like taking candy from a baby. Armed with the necessary plates and the intelligence that their allied Amit team had given them prior to the exam, they'd been on course to reaching the exit of the maze and passing the second exam with ease. If they hadn't gotten so caught up in the elation of their seemingly imminent success, they might have lasted a few seconds longer. Their first indication of danger was when Mubi dropped his umbrella on the ground with a clatter. The boy himself quickly followed after, convulsing uncontrollably on the ground as white froth bubbled out from the side of his mouth. Reacting instinctively, Kagari and Oboro jumped away from their teammate, just in time to avoid the two kunai that now embedded themselves harmlessly in the ground. Kagari's and Oboro's hands both blurred, Bunshin no Jutsu. As several clones appeared around them with swirling clouds of mist, they rapidly continued to form seals in succession, earth release, earth swim technique. The earth below them turned fluid, and the two rapidly sunk below its depths, leaving behind their clones. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the tremors of unmistakable battle filtered through the earth towards them. Oboro turned to Kagari, who nodded back at him, his eyes narrowed from behind his rebreather. The two burst back up to the surface, spinning in midair as their umbrellas rapidly spat out poison-tipped needles in opposite directions. All around them, as they stood back to back in their practiced stances, their sacrificial clones burst into mist. Oboro blinked at the dark clearing around them. "Where are they?" he hissed, looking around rapidly. Given that they hadn't even sensed their enemy creeping up on them, he hadn't expected to take them out so easily, but he hadn't expected the enemy to simply not be there. But all he could see was Kagari's anxious face beside his, and what was that small blue thing fluttering around above them next to that stalactite? Wait, was that a bird? This far underground? Before he could even open his mouth to yell out a warning, however, his remaining teammate dropped like a stone beside him, white froth creeping out from his orifices. Oboro felt his heart sink as he remembered the promise he'd made to his younger brother before he'd left the village. Quickly making up his mind, he threw his umbrella down on the ground and raised his hands. "I surrender," he said loudly. "Just let me and my teammates live, and I'll give you our plates." Just as his eyes flicked down to his left pocket, he saw a flash of red above him. His heart thudded sickeningly. And then everything turned black. Naruto didn't know what to think, and this, there were no other words for it, simply bewildered him. He was no stranger to pain, and over time, he had gotten into the habit of analyzing the cause of everything that hurt him. He reasoned that to minimize pain, he had to understand it. But what he was feeling now wasn't the usual kind of pain, which was sharp and obvious. Instead, what he felt now was a blunt axe that hacked away at the fraying edges of his mind, as a numbing sense of disbelief and something else he couldn't name spread throughout his body. "So go tell your village and your Hokage. Go tell them that Takagakure is raising up a weapon in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Come and destroy it for us." Naruto had moved methodically to tighten the rope bindings around the 2 Takagakure Genins, but his mind had already begun to race with the implications. If Mishimi was telling the truth, and his body language and tone all supported that he was, then first of all, this meant that there was more than one tailed beast still roaming the world. Naruto had tried once before to look up information about the 9 tails in the archive library, as he was unable to dismiss the feeling of uneasiness he'd gotten during Mizuki-sensei's Memorial Day lecture. And he had managed to ascertain one thing before being chased out by the Chunin librarian: there was absolutely not even a single scroll on its origins, its known powers, or its fate. Granted, he didn't think that there could have been extensive research on such a colossal force of nature, but the fact that there was absolutely no information on it could mean only one thing: that it was classified, not to be disclosed even to the shinobi. It gave him a headache to think of it, and Naruto had decided that it must have been one of the village's top secrets, something to be handled only by the elite and the Hokage himself, and certainly not by lowly academy students such as himself. And so, he had put his inquisitiveness aside. But now, he found himself being forced back into a similar train of thoughts. And as fearful as the thought of tailed beasts in the plural was, the second implication in the Genin's words was, in Naruto's opinion, even worse, that these monsters of legend could actually be sealed away within people. He didn't know much about Fuinjutsu, except that it was a type of jutsu that sealed objects within other objects. He'd always assumed there was a limit to what could be sealed and what could be done with what was sealed. But if a tailed beast could be sealed within a person, and if that person could somehow harness the tailed beast's chakra, then such a person might very well be invincible. And Mishimi had said that Takagakure was raising up such a person, a Jinchuriki, he'd called it, in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Did this mean that all of the great villages had a Jinchuriki of their own? A weapon that, by all intents of nature, shouldn't exist? If that was the case, then could the 9 tails not in fact have been destroyed by the 4th Hokage? Could he have sealed it away instead? Inside a person? Maybe even a baby? Naruto suddenly recalled that the 4th had been a sealing master. He had found this out when he'd been trying to figure out what the black seal on his abdomen was. Come to think of it, he hadn't seen his seal in a long time. But that was because it only appeared when he nudged his red chakra. But why was he thinking of his red chakra now? He hadn't touched or thought of it in years. Come and destroy it for us. Mishimi's hate-filled eyes flashed once more in his mind's memory. Naruto felt another headache coming. He knew those eyes very well. Where had he seen those kinds of eyes before? Hadn't they, Naruto? He jerked in surprise, his hand automatically reaching for the tantan strapped across his back. Besides him, Rai blanched and took a step back. Recognizing his teammate, Naruto immediately relaxed and let go of the blade's handle. Looking around, Naruto noted in surprise that the Takagakure Genins were nowhere to be seen. In fact, they seemed to be walking somewhere. For a split second, he couldn't remember where and why they were moving. "What's up with you?" said Rai, eyeing him curiously. Naruto hesitated. "Nothing, I just spaced out," he finally said. The rest of the second exam passed by quickly and easily, despite their increasing misgivings. Naruto's shadow clone found an Omegakure team with 2 plates that had let their guards down enough for them to be sneaked up on. Mayu's genjutsu incapacitated 2 of them with ease, and after Naruto took down the third with a simple chop across the back of his neck, they trussed up their second genin team to a boulder. With 3 plates now in their possession, they rested briefly before moving onwards, and after several more hours with no further confrontations, they finally reached the end of the maze. They emerged out of the sloping dark tunnel to see that it was midday above ground. They were somewhere in the desert away from the Suna village, and there was not a cloud in the sky. The strong sunlight seared their eyes after having spent days in almost constant darkness. Nevertheless, Rai flung himself on the hot sandy ground with a moan of bliss, soaking up the sunlight with his outstretched arms. Following him outside, a wide smile spread across Mayu's face even as her eyes squinted in pain. Naruto, on the other hand, remained tense, his eyes roving around, as if looking for possible ambush spots. Rai, seeing this, rolled his watering eyes. "Naruto, we're finally out of that hellhole. Lighten up." Naruto ignored him, continuing his visual search. Rai sighed in long-suffering exasperation. But before he could say anything else, the sound of light footsteps alerted them to a Suna Chunin climbing up the hill towards them. His face was mostly covered with bandages and a face mask, and he wore the standard Suna flak jacket. The man held his hand out. "Plates please." Immediately, Mayu began to reach inside the folds of her cloak when Naruto flung out 4 shuriken from his holster. As the shuriken spiraled through the air towards the Chunin with a whistling sound, Rai let out a yelp of surprise, but instantly, the Chunin had his kunai out and batted away the shuriken with ease. Mayu stared gapingly down at the shuriken embedded in the ground and then back up at Naruto. Slowly, the Chunin lowered his kunai and leveled a sharp gaze at Naruto. "Attack an examiner again, and you'll be disqualified from the exam." "What was that for?" Rai demanded. Naruto didn't apologize. "For all we knew, you could have been another examinee trying to take our plates at the very last second." It was difficult to tell the Chunin's facial expression from behind his mask, but Naruto could have sworn he saw something twitch. "My name is Tsubasa, and I am one of the Chunin examiners for this year's Chunin selection exam at Sunagakure. It has been exactly 29 hours and 44 minutes since the exam began. Congratulations on passing the second exam." As Tsubasa led them back to the village, picking his way through a sandy path that only he seemed to be able to see, Naruto noticed several other entrances scattered around the ground. In the distance, he saw another worn-out team emerging up to the ground as a Suna Chunin patiently waited for them. "How do you guys know when to pick us up?" Rai piped up from behind him. "Cameras," said Tsubasa. Contrary to what some may have thought, the second exam was not meant to be an all-out battle royale, with the examiners being blind to its happenings. "And you guys wanted to see what the future ninja of other villages have got up their sleeves, eh?" "That too," Tsubasa admitted. "So did you see that girl that attacked us?" Rai continued. "She creamed us." Naruto stopped short. At the same time, Rai let out a yelp of pain and stumbled forward. It appeared that Mayu had kicked him. "What was that F? Oh, we did not have a camera in every tunnel, so we may have missed that one," Tsubasa replied calmly. Naruto's eyes narrowed. The pause before he'd spoken had been a millisecond too long. Naruto was certain that he was lying. And he would have bet his prized hand that every single Suna examiner and official knew of Takagakure's Jinchuriki. But for now, it seemed they would be feigning ignorance. The question was, had they found out from Mishimi's outburst, or had they known even before that? And if they had, why had they let her participate in their exam? Naruto and his team were brought past the village gate and inside one of the circular clay buildings. Contrary to its heavy and dull appearance, it was cool and airy inside, and they gratefully removed their heavy cloaks. Mei sniffed her sleeve and cringed, thrusting the cloak away from her. To Rai's outrage, they were the second team once again to pass, this time having been beat out by Guy's team of rookies. The three rookies looked battered but thrilled about their success. When Neji saw them enter, he gave them a cool smirk. With 3 days left as the second exam continued, they were guided to separate quarters where they could clean up, eat, and rest. After taking a long refreshing bath and saying good night to his teammates, Rai looked disappointed. He had been excited about going out to explore the village but had been told by Tsubasa that they were not allowed to leave the building until the exam was over in order to prevent sabotage. Naruto turned in early and tossed and turned in his bed all night. The next day, he rose early and was surprised to see that breakfast had been laid just outside his door. It was a tray of Suna cuisine and nothing that he was used to. The meat was chewy and dry, and his soup filled with something that looked like seaweed but tasted sweet. Nevertheless, as Naruto ate, he felt a touch of nostalgia, remembering back to the caretaker who had once prepared all of his meals. Strangely enough, he had never seen her again after she left him, and for the first time in years, he wondered where she was. Naruto couldn't even remember her face. All he could remember was that she had been stern and quick with her hand. He suddenly wondered why he'd been left with a caretaker and not in the orphanage like every other child in Konoha who'd lost their parents in the war. He'd never thought too deeply of it before, but now, he wondered how he could never have questioned it before. And yet, each question raised even further questions. After breakfast as planned, Naruto and his teammates assembled in the corridor that connected their rooms. Because their own clothes were dirty and being washed, they all wore the dark long tunics that was Suna's traditional clothing. While the clothes were surprisingly lightweight and cool, Naruto privately thought it made them all look lumpy and shapeless. He hadn't noticed the night before because it had been too dark, but now that sunlight had crept into the hallway, Naruto saw that there was a small window that looked outside. Stepping forward and peering out, he realized that it overlooked the center of the village market. The sun was still rising and hung low in the sky, but he could see the market was already beginning to bustle with activity. "I wonder how many teams passed the second exam," said Rai, with a great yawn. "Since we ended with 3 plates instead of 2, that means we took out 2 teams, right? What do you think the third exam will be?" "Some kind of sparring match, probably," said Mayu, leaning against a wall. "My brother told me that's what most villages do for the third exam when they host the Chunin exams." From what Naruto had been able to gather, Mayu's older brother was a Chunin who manned Konoha's village gates. "Sparring? Huh," said Rai, scratching his nose. "I hope I'm paired with someone easy then. Someone like Tenten or one of those other rookies. And not, let's see. Oh, I know. I really wouldn't like to go up against that, what did they call her? That Jinchuriki then. If she beat Naruto that easily, the rest of us wouldn't stand a chance." Glancing around the corridor to make sure it was empty, his voice nevertheless dropped an octave. "Is it even fair though, having her in the exam? We're just Genins, even Naruto here wouldn't stand a chance against a tailed beast." Mayu didn't respond. "Assuming the third exam involves one-on-one sparring, it's not to say that you have to absolutely win your match to pass," said Naruto. "The first 2 exams were to weed out the weak. Now that only the strong Genins are left, they'll be wanting us to showcase our abilities. So even if you lose to your opponent, if you make a strong showing, you could still pass." "That makes sense," said Rai seriously. And then, a sly smile spread itself across his face, his scar twisting as it did so. "Guess Tenten doesn't stand a chance then." "Oh, this again? Just leave her alone." "What do you have against her?" admonished Mayu. "Everything," Rai shot back. "Grow up." Tuning out the bickering voices of his teammates, Naruto continued looking out the window. This was the second village outside of his own that he'd ever seen in his life, and the similarities and differences he found were startling to him. The people of Konoha were more boisterous and familiar, greeting each other with wide grins and a slap on the back or a kiss to the cheek. The people of Suna, on the other hand, seemed much calmer and more reserved. As he watched, though people politely greeted each other good morning, there was always a certain distance between each other. Naruto wondered whether it was merely custom or whether the extreme climates of the desert bred a certain kind of personality. Yet at the same time, he thought, people here also woke up early to go to the market to buy food to put on the table for their families. Suddenly, there was a loud banging noise just below his window. At the sound, Naruto reared back, his hand reaching for his tantan once more. There was a lull in the cacophony behind him, and striding over, Rai stuck his head out the window and glanced down. "Someone just knocked something over, Naruto," he said, turning around. "What are you being so jittery for? You've been really weird lately." "It's nothing," Naruto said. "I'm just tired." Rai shook his head, but let it go. Stretching once more and saying something about looking for the kitchen to get more food, the Genin shot off down the corridor. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, Mayu mumbled something about looking for something and fled into her own room. After a moment's hesitation, Naruto walked back to the window and looked down. Pieces of a red clay pot were scattered on the ground. Though the contents seemed harmless, for some reason, everyone in the market was giving it a wide berth. Standing in the middle, paying no attention to the beans strewn around his feet, was a boy who looked Naruto's age, with spiky auburn hair. But that was where the physical similarities ended. He was much paler and wore Sunagenin attire. Naruto was fairly certain he hadn't seen him in the Chunin exams. He knew he would have remembered someone like that in the exam. The boy was standing stiffly with his arms crossed, seemingly observing the flow of traffic that circled fearfully around him. Then without warning, the boy tilted his head back and with wrathful black ringed eyes, glared hatefully back up at Naruto. Naruto stepped back away from the window. Retreating to the opposite end of the corridor, where it was still dark, he leaned against a wall and slid down to the ground, massaging his temples. The blunt axe was back again, accompanied once more by that aching headache that prickled and lurked at the edges of his consciousness. "I am," he said quietly to the familiar darkness. "I am likely a Jinchuriki." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Stalemate. The faint moonlight made the water in the wash basin glow eerily. Looking down at his face, reflected on the water's surface, Naruto grimaced as he recalled his recent revelations. He couldn't think of a word to describe how he felt. It was as though he had been blind and his eyes had been newly opened to the real world. As though a bubble that had separated him from the truth had dissipated. But unfortunately, this reality had never been something he wanted. All of his musings from childhood seemed silly to him now. How could he have never connected the dots before? His entire life, the other villagers had isolated and despised him. Reasoning it out, he had concluded that their driving factor was hatred, and he now knew for sure that he hadn't been wrong there. But now he saw that there was an even bigger factor, namely, fear. He had been orphaned the night that the Nine Tails attacked, but unlike the other orphans, he had been kept separate from them. And that was because the villagers, unlike him, had known that something colossal like the Nine Tails could not have been defeated, not even by the fourth Hokage, but only sealed away. To think that for 10 years, they had had to live within the same walls as the monster that had killed their loved ones. Naruto gazed down at the whisker-like marks on the face that stared back at him from the water's surface. After a moment, he broke the surface of the water with his hand, contorting his reflection. Why had he never questioned the seal that appeared on his belly when he nudged the red chakra in his body? He had just dismissed it and never thought about it again after his initial curiosity. Naruto felt sick at the vague memory. How many other markers had he missed because of his lack of attention? Suddenly, feeling an overwhelming urge to vomit, he covered his mouth. His headache had been growing increasingly worse all day, and now his head was throbbing again. Panting, Naruto leaned back against a sandy wall for support as his surroundings spun dizzily around him. As soon as the nausea had passed, he splashed some of the cold water on his hot face and then went to lie down on his bed. His heart pounding, he dazedly wondered whether he had contracted some kind of strange desert bug before his heavy eyes closed shut. The day the second exam ended, everyone who had finished was taken out to the field of dunes, where all the tunnels opened up to the surface. With the exception of the Konoha rookies, it was the first time since they had come into Suna that they had seen any of other Genins. Taking a cursory look around during their short walk, Naruto noted that besides his and Neji's team, only Kabuto's team had made it from Konoha. However, none of the teams from the other villages seemed to have fared any better. Overall, they looked rather more disheveled and worn down. At the field, as expected, a large number of Suna shinobi officials were waiting. However, standing beside them were a number of foreign jonin, including one very familiar face. Kakashi-sensei. Mayu called out in surprise, coming to a stop. The jonin raised a hand in casual greeting as he strolled over. "So you guys are still in one piece, I see. Did you expect any less?" Rai snorted, folding his arms across his chest. Ever since he'd been kicked out of the Suna kitchen, he had been in an irritable mood. "Are you supposed to be here?" Mayu asked skeptically. "Hey, now. It's custom for the sensei to be present during the third exam," Kakashi explained. "In fact, there are usually a substantial number of spectators from every village during the third exam. After all, the Chunin exam is what decides which ninja will be showing up on the battlefield. Mayu's eyes widened. But all the nations here are allied, aren't they? Alliances can, and have, changed in a heartbeat, said Kakashi in a solemn voice. The man, or woman, you shared a drink with over the campfire could be the one to stab you in the back when the fire dies. Suddenly, he clapped his hands together, startling them. But enough of that business. You three should just concentrate on the upcoming exam. As if taking that as a cue, the Suna Chunin who had picked them up, Tsubasa, raised a hand in signal. Kakashi, as well as the other foreign Jonin, returned back to their formation. When the Genin had all amassed into a single group, he spoke. As of now, the second test of the Sunagakur Chunin exam is, the rest of his sentence was cut off, as with a sudden flurry of sand, a red and white figure burst out of one of the tunnel holes in the ground. Whew. I almost overslept, that was way too close. As one, all heads turned to stare at the Genin who casually brushed the sand off her head. Isn't that, Fu? Rai hissed unnecessarily into Naruto's ear. Hearing her name, the green-haired Kunoichi looked their way with an unexpectedly hard expression on her face, and Rai involuntarily took a step back. Ahem, Tsubasa caught their attention with a cough. As I was saying, as of now, the second test of the Sunagakur Chunin exam is now over. Taking into account the most recent arrival, 24 individuals coming from a total of 11 teams have passed. Congratulations. At this point, a particularly bedraggled-looking AMA team was unable to contain their joy, triumphantly thrusting the tips of their umbrellas up into the air. The Kazekage will now address you all. Tsubasa nodded towards the group of Suna shinobi, which parted in the middle to reveal a robed figure of middling size. Stern dark eyes bored into them from beneath the green-pointed hat that denoted him as the strongest shinobi of Sunagakur. Congratulations on making it this far, said the Kazekage in a deep and raspy voice. However, it is too early to celebrate. He pointedly looked towards the celebrating members of the AIM team, who shrunk under his gaze. The Chunin exam is a valuable tool for evaluating the performances of the future generations of shinobi. You can think of everything until now as a preliminary test to weed out the worthless from those with potential. It is only from this point onwards that your mettle will truly be tested. The third exam, which will take place 2 weeks from now, will be a series of fights in which you must be the victor in order to proceed to the next round. Rai nudged Mayu, who had paled. I cannot stress enough the importance of your display during this third exam. You may be merely Genin now, but you will, in the future, be the soldiers of your village. In a sense, you are showing the strength of your village to the other villages. A weak showing will reflect poorly on your village and invite stronger villages to take advantage. In essence, from here on out, you are determining the futures of your villages. The Kazekage looked balefully around at them. It was completely quiet. Now, according to your individual performances from the first and second exams, every person, with no regard for nation or team, has been divided into 8 separate brackets. The victors of each bracket will face each other until there is only one remaining, who will be guaranteed a pass in the exams. Breaking the silence, the group of Genins began to murmur amongst each other. The Kazekage raised a hand to quell them. This does not mean, however, that only one person will be passing. From this moment on, every single one of you is being considered for a promotion to the Chunin rank. So I expect you all, as representatives of your respective villages, to prove yourselves in these rounds. At these words, a tall and bald Suna Jonin stepped forward. Thank you, Kazekage-sama. I will take it from here, said the Jonin, bowing deeply. He straightened up and turned to look at them. My name is Satetsu, and I will be the head referee for the third exam. To start things off, due to the larger than expected number of remaining contenders, there will be a preliminary round. You will be divided into divisions where 3, instead of 2, Genins will fight each other. There will be no rules besides that you must remain in this field. The fight will continue until 2 of you are dead, knocked out, or admit defeat. There may also be a situation in which the winner has been clearly decided. Rather than unnecessarily adding blood to the field, I will step in and declare the victor. He cleared his throat. Now then, you were each individually evaluated during the first and second exams, and using these results, the divisions have been drawn to be as fair as possible. Several Suna Chunin rolled out a large white cloth with a tournament bracket chart etched on it in dull black ink. Naruto found his name immediately. It was the first name written in the very first bracket. The 2 names next to his were Kabuto and Karen. Scanning the rest of the brackets, he saw that almost all the other Konoha Genin had been split up into separate brackets. It seemed that by fair, they had meant that they intended the strongest Genins to face each other in the later rounds of the tournament rather than in the preliminary. Likely to provide the most entertainment for the various higher-ranking country officials that would be coming to view the actual third exam. His gaze lingered momentarily on Mayu's bracket, which was fourth. One of the names was unfamiliar to him, but the other name was Fu. Either they had scribbled Fu's name into one of the brackets as soon as she emerged, or more likely, they had known she had passed and had proactively written her in. Naruto glanced at Mayu, but for once, her face was unreadable. We will commence with the preliminary round of the third exam immediately. First up is Bracket 1, Uzumaki Naruto from Konoha, Yakushi Kabuto from Konoha, and Karen of Kusagakure. They're sure not wasting any time, Rai grumbled, scratching his scar. Good luck, Naruto. Not that you need it. Mayu nodded. Good luck, Naruto. Wordlessly, Naruto stepped out onto the field. Kabuto walked past him, his sandaled feet crunching in the sand, and turned around to face him several meters away. A bespectacled girl with flaming bright red hair and eyes wearing a Kusagakure Hit-8 did the same, finishing the triangle. At the same time, several Suna Jonin stepped out and with a jutsu, raised a circular sand barrier that separated the bystanders from the three Genin, creating a makeshift arena. Are you ready? Said Satetsu. Yes, said Naruto and Karen simultaneously. Kabuto silently adjusted his glasses. Then, begin. The girl seemed to have judged Kabuto as the easier of the two. She immediately flung several kunai in his direction. Barely dodging them, Kabuto tripped over his own feet and fell on the ground. Karen began running towards him, but skidded to a stop when he raised his hand. There was a momentary silence before Satetsu cleared his throat. Yes? I forfeit, Kabuto said, looking embarrassed. He stood up, dusting the sand off his pants, and began to limp back to the wall of the barrier. My foot's been bothering me since the second exam, and I doubt I can carry on much longer. Personally, Naruto thought that the limp looked fake. It was much more likely that Kabuto had ascertained that he had no chance against a competition of that year and had just chickened out. That was so not cool, man, said Rai, shaking his head. Hearing him, Kabuto gave a sheepish smile before going to the back to sit beside his teammates. Okay then, Kabuto Yakushi from Konoha has been eliminated from Bracket 1, Satetsu rolled his eyes. He raised his hand once more. Continue. Naruto hadn't moved since stepping out onto the field. This seemed to unsettle the Kusa Genin. Hesitating for a second, she flung another pair of kunai at Naruto. Deflecting the kunai with his own, Naruto stayed otherwise still. Running around him in circular motions, Karen continued to throw kunai at him, all of which he blocked. Finally, apparently having run out of artillery, she launched herself at him with surprising speed, leaving a small cloud of sand in her wake. Feinting to the right, she ducked and swiped at his feet to try and knock him off balance. Naruto twisted and kicked at her open back. She grunted at the direct hit, but to his surprise, reached behind her to wrap her arms around his leg. Again, with a surprising amount of strength, Karen pushed up, propelling him into the air. Jumping up, she punched at him. However, Naruto ducked, and quicker than she could react, he grabbed a hold of her collar. Her eyes widened just as he slammed her down to the ground. Her body hit the ground with enough impact to cause deep cracks to appear in the ground around her. A cloud of dust and sand erupted around Karen's groaning figure. Naruto nimbly landed several meters away. When the dust had cleared, however, he noted with some surprise that Karen had already gotten up. Furthermore, aside from a slightly dazed expression, she seemed unhurt. An impressed murmur spread throughout the watching crowd. Naruto gazed impassively at her figure. Contrary to her rather flimsy appearance, she was quite sturdy. If he continued to fight her the way he had planned to, it would likely only drag out for a long time as he slowly whittled away at her defenses. Making up his mind, he brought his hands together. Wind release, gale. A gust of wind spiraled into existence, picking up sand and forming a large dust cloud that engulfed the entire arena. There were yelps of indignant pain from the group of Genins as some of the sand blew into their eyes. Shadow clone technique. Under the cloud of the dust, Naruto created 4 shadow clones. Karen meanwhile had stood rooted in her position, bracing herself. She seemed fairly intelligent and had likely predicted Naruto's intentions under the cover of dust. However, there was little she could do against 5 assailants. As his clones distracted her, Naruto crept in from her blind spot. Raising his kunai, he aimed at the back of her neck, prepared to deal the finishing blow when suddenly, as if she had known he'd been the real one the whole time, Karen twisted her head to look directly at him. With flashing red eyes, she flung a kunai at him, and for the first time, he was forced to jump back and retreat. Appraising the red-headed genin from afar, Naruto cocked his head in bemusement. Interesting, either it had been a lucky guess, which he doubted, or she had some sort of sensory ability that allowed her to differentiate between clones. If that was the case, his current plan wouldn't work either, and the ball was back in Karen's court. She seemed to have reached the same conclusion. Apparently not having yet exhausted her supply of kunai, she resumed throwing them at him, warily maintaining her distance. Just the same as before, Naruto continued blocking them, creating a momentary standstill. For several moments, it was silent, except for the sound of metal clashing on metal as the two stared at each other, waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, Karen seemed to have grown impatient. Her final pair missed him entirely, flying over his head. At the same time, she propelled herself headfirst in his direction once more. Prepared, Naruto reached behind him for his tanto. Just before Karen reached him, he took a small leap backwards, focusing his wind chakra along the blade of his tanto. He pulled out the tanto in a single, fluid motion. Upon seeing the blade, Karen immediately stopped and began to reverse direction. Out of fear, he thought for a split moment when he suddenly heard something hissing behind him. Still looking directly at Karen, Naruto saw the tips of her lips curl up into a small smile, and in the same split second, saw belatedly that her hands were in the snake hand seal. Then, before he even had enough time to widen his eyes, there was a loud explosion as the exploding tags behind him detonated. A collective gasp swept through the crowd as a large violent ball of fire engulfed Naruto's figure. The billowing smoke rapidly filled the entire arena. Naruto? Mayu choked out in a shocked voice. She moved forward, as if to run in, but was stopped by a raised hand from Kakashi, who had suddenly appeared beside them during the ruckus. Kakashi silently shook his head at her. Meanwhile, leaping over the barrier, the referee ninja had disappeared into the thick smoke. What happened? Rai gasped, wide-eyed. It seems that your genius was outsmarted, said Neji, folding his arms across his chest. Fu let out an admiring whistle. Naruto, outsmarted? Rai repeated dumbly. Kakashi-sensei, what? The Jonin didn't respond. You better start getting ready for your match, Tenten, said Neji, turning to his teammate. Looking dazed, she seemed startled at his suggestion. Right, she said weakly. The winner of preliminary round 1, Satetsu's bodiless voice emerged from the smoke, recapturing their attention. Neji closed his eyes, nodding his head in affirmation. Is Uzumaki Naruto? Neji's eyes snapped open in shock. There was a momentary pause of collective confusion. What? Called out a Genin. You sure you haven't gotten the names wrong? Yeah. We saw Karen win, said the girl next to him. I can't see anything, another Genin complained. In response, one of the Jonin raised a large metal fan and waved it once towards the arena. Immediately, a strong wind swept through once more, this time taking away the smoke, to reveal a completely different scene from the one they had been left with. Karen was sitting motionlessly on her knees, with a look of fear frozen on her face. Naruto stood just as still behind her, one hand gripping the top of her red hair, while the other held the blade of his tanto to the front of her neck. As mentioned earlier, I can decide during a match if a victor is made clear, growled Satetsu. Now, lower your tanto. For a tangibly tense second, Naruto didn't move, looking down at the girl with a blank expression on his face. A thin trickle of bright blood slid down his blade and dripped down onto the sand. He'd been in this position before and seen this scene before, he thought distantly. Karen let out a pained whimper. Upon hearing her, as though breaking out of a reverie, Naruto released his grip on her head and slid the tanto back into its strap on his back. Karen slumped onto the ground. Several medic nin hurried over to the Genin's prone figure. Ignoring the murmuring and questioning gazes of the crowd, Naruto jumped over the barrier and walked over to Kakashi's side. What happened? Rai said eagerly in a tone of great relief that indicated that the world was as it should be once more. I thought that even you wouldn't have enough time to dodge that. I did, said Naruto shortly. Good ol' Naruto, said Rai, slinging his arm around his head. You scared me there for a sec. Mayu too, right? He nudged the pale-faced girl beside him, who nodded mutely. I thought that maybe that flu you caught had made you slower or something. The flu? Kakashi questioned, reaching out with a hand to Naruto. Naruto, were you sick? Taken aback, Naruto shook his head. No, I'm fine. Of course you are, Rai beamed. He turned to Mayu. I'm more worried about you. My fight's gonna be a piece of cake, but you're up against that Jinchuriki girl." In an unusual slip of his composure, Kakashi's hand jerked. At that, Naruto turned to regard his teammate in bewilderment. What was Rai talking about? Jinchuriki? He repeated slowly. He couldn't recall ever having heard that word before. And yet for some reason, the word did not feel unfamiliar on his tongue. Something throbbed in his head, and Naruto winced. "Yeah," said Rai obliviously, waving his hand. "You know. That girl foo." But before he could ask him what a Jinchuriki was, the second round of the preliminaries began. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. Goodbye Memory. The next few rounds of the preliminary went by fairly quickly. In the second round, Tenten and the other Genin were overwhelmed by a Genin named Tamari, who'd simply blown away all the artillery with a giant metal fan. In the next bracket, Rai lucked out. It turned out that the two other Genin, a Suna and an AIM Genin, hated each other's guts and spent all of their energy trying to beat the other. When the AIM Genin narrowly emerged victorious, Rai pounced and made short work of him. "Nice work," Kakashi praised Rai, who clambered over the sandy barrier with a triumphant grin. "Good job," said Kabuto, pushing up his glasses. Tenten, who was standing nearby, regarded Rai with a sour look. "Did you see that move I made at the end there?" said Rai, swiping the air with his kunai. "It was like, oh please," Tenten cut in with a snort, folding her arms across her chest. "All you did was stand around and try to look invisible for most of that round." Though she'd been promptly restored to working condition by the medic Nin, it seemed her pride had not yet made a full recovery. Rai turned to her with the irritated look on his face. "Don't you have somewhere else to be? Like the stands?" Tenten scowled. "You wouldn't have done any better than me if you were up against an actual opponent." "Oh yeah?" Rai growled. "I guess we'll see in the third exam about that then." "The third exam you won't be participating in." Tenten reddened, and for a second, Naruto thought she would hit him. But then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stiffly walked away. As Rai fumed, from the corner of his eye, Naruto saw Mayu biting her lip, as though debating within herself whether or not to talk. "Your abilities and fighting style are fairly similar to Tenten's," Naruto remarked. "You might not have won against that Genin either." Rai's jaw dropped. "What?" "She was just upset she lost," Mayu piped in, looking upset. "You shouldn't have taunted her like that." Rai slowly looked back and forth between them before shaking his head. "You two are never on my side," he groaned. "I'm just stating facts," said Naruto matter-of-factly. Rai turned towards his last hope with a pleading look. "Kabuto?" "Sorry Rai, but I'll have to agree with the rest on this one," Kabuto said with an apologetic smile. Rai let out a long-suffering sigh. "Fine," he said, throwing his hands up. "Fine. I'll go apologize." Hunched over, he slunk into the throng of Genin. Kakashi, who had been wordlessly watching the situation unfold, finally let out a chuckle. "You all rather remind me of my own team back in the day." Feeling a lick of curiosity welling up, Naruto turned toward the Jonin. "What was your team like, sensei?" "We were always fighting," was all Kakashi said, before turning to look back at the arena. Naruto's gaze lingered on his sensei. He seemed distracted. Ever since his own match had ended, Kakashi had been sneaking discreet glances at him every now and then, before shaking his head and looking away. Was it because of that thing Rai had said? Jinchuriki? He'd been meaning to ask Rai about it, but with Rai's battle being so soon after his, he hadn't gotten a chance to. And now, he was off doing who knew what. But what could Rai have been talking about? Jinchuriki, was it a code name for something else? Shaking his head to clear it, Naruto turned to look back at the arena as well. The second half of the preliminaries was starting now, and the first ones up were, "Well that's rotten luck," said Kabuto. "They're both on the same team, aren't they? Neji Hyuga and Rock Lee." "I wonder if that's why Tenten was so upset," said Mayu slowly. "Since she lost, and Neji and Lee are in the same bracket, only one member on their team gets to pass to the third exam." Naruto silently observed the three figures who stood in the center of the arena. Neji, with his arms crossed, was an emotionless wall. Rock Lee, on the other hand, had an interesting mix of determination and anxiety etched across his face. Looking over the third Genin, a jittery-looking Suna, with a practice tie, Naruto mentally dismissed him from the battle. This would come down to be a fight between the two male Konoha rookies. "Begin," said Satetsu, who leaped out of the arena. The Suna Genin immediately jumped away from the Konoha Nin, pulling the bandaged humanoid puppet off his back. "Lee," said Neji, ignoring the Suna Genin completely. He stood stock still. Forfeit now. You've never beaten me, and you never will. Rock Lee lowered himself into a taijutsu stance. Neji, I respect you as a genius. But as I am sure you know by now, I never give up. Neji shook his head and lowering himself into a stance, the veins around his eyes bulged outwards as the boy activated his infamous heritage. The fight was over in less than 5 minutes. At first, Lee seemed to be moving too quickly for Neji to follow, making sure to stay out of his reach. When the Genin distracted Neji with his puppet, Lee finally jumped in for his attack, but unfortunately for him, nothing got past the Byakugan's all-seeing power. As soon as Lee was in Neji's reach, it was all over him. With what seemed like a series of gentle jabs to Lee's torso and legs, the boy crumpled to the ground. The Genin soon followed after, being easily incapacitated with a few jabs to the hands controlling the puppet. The winner of preliminary round 4 is Neji Hyuga. Without a look back at his teammate who still lay on the ground, Neji left the arena. It's unfortunate, but Rock Lee wouldn't have stood a chance against any competent ninja, let alone a genius like Hyuga, said Kabuto, adjusting his glasses. What do you mean? Asked Mayu curiously. He can't use any ninjutsu or genjutsu. It's amazing that he's come this far with just taijutsu, but this is where the road ends for him, came the answer. They fell silent, and soon after, Kabuto excused himself, returning to his teammates. It took a second for Naruto to realize that Mayu had also wordlessly begun walking towards the arena. Naruto's gaze lowered to her trembling hands, and he let out an internal sigh. With that kind of mentality going in, he doubted she'd come out victorious. He looked towards her opponents, Fu and another Genin were already waiting inside the arena. As his gaze fell on the Taki Genin, the girl seemed to notice. Turning around, she locked gazes with him for a second. Then, baring her teeth at him, Fu gave him a sarcastic little wave before returning her attention to the others in the arena. Bemused, Naruto cocked his head, his thoughts returning once more to Rai's words and Kakashi's strange reaction towards them. Fu, he said her name out loud quietly. Rai had called her a Jinchuriki, but what did that even mean? Maybe Rai had been messing around like usual, and it hadn't meant anything. But Kakashi's reaction had been strange, so perhaps there was something else to it that he was missing? Naruto's forehead furrowed, and he reached up to massage his temple with his hand. His head was starting to throb again. Wincing, Naruto glanced sideways at Kakashi. He opened his mouth and then hesitated. Should he ask the Jonin? Normally, he wouldn't have hesitated. If there was anyone he trusted, it was his sensei. But Kakashi's previously bizarre reaction gave him pause. He squeezed his temples. It was getting harder to think straight with his head aching like this. Was this another relapse of that weird desert sickness? How come he was sick, anyways, while no one else was? Naruto, are you alright? Naruto almost jumped in surprise before returning to his senses. How odd, he'd nearly forgotten that the Jonin was there. With a mental shrug, he decided that it couldn't hurt to ask, what had he been going to ask again? In some distant part of his mind, alarm bells were ringing, but for some reason, Naruto was finding it hard to focus on them. Dazedly, he looked back at the arena. The round had started. Mayu was racing away, while the Genin from Takagakure was spewing a shiny powder that hurt his eyes. What had been the girl's name again? Naruto? His eyes widened as he actually jumped this time. He'd forgotten Kakashi-sensei was there again. What was going on? What was wrong with his mind? He felt like he was drowning in an increasingly thicker fog. Focus, Naruto, he told himself, massaging his temples. Closing his eyes, he mentally retreated to his sanctuary. Here, he had studied all of his difficult Tai-0 jutsu stances and committed his jutsu to memory. But to his immense shock, whereas he had previously imagined it as a great expanse of nothing, there was something else there now. A giant, bulky gelatin-like block that was rapidly expanding in all directions even now. But there. It hadn't taken over completely just yet. Naruto dove to grasp the fleeting thought before it was crushed for good under the block. Sensei, do you know what Rai meant by a Jinchuriki? He managed to choke out. What? Kakashi sounded taken aback. So, you don't know what he meant? No, but Naruto stopped with a hiss as he was forcibly ejected from his own sanctuary. He let out a groan as the wave of pain collapsed over him. Everything around him was beginning to spin dizzily, just like it had several days ago. What's wrong? Kakashi's voice was muted and distant, as if he were talking to him through a thick wall. Naruto staggered, his hands falling limply to his sides. The air was thick and hazy, and his mouth felt like a leaden lump of clay. He mumbled something through a thick tongue before everything turned black. As she slowly walked into the arena, there were so many thoughts and voices in her head that Mayu was starting to feel rather sick. It was a tumultuous cacophony, a restless tornado that raged through her mind. There was no time to breathe or think. Only react. I thought we had agreed that you were going to keep your distance from it. She skipped the academy today again. You don't mean you're making a cake for that thing, are you? Get away from him. He'll kill you. He's a monster. Where are you going? Mayu flinched in surprise and then stumbled. Regaining her bearings, she looked around in a daze. Her surroundings had suddenly changed. She was already at the center of the sandy arena, where an Genin and Fu waited for her. Mayu blinked. Fu had been the one to call out to her. Are you ready? The Jonin growled, glaring around at them. Mayu's eyes darted away, not wanting to meet his eyes. Then begin. The Genin immediately jumped into the air, lifting his umbrella and spinning it to release a torrent of deadly poison-tipped needles. Fu hopped away, while Mayu, almost tripping again, just barely managed to get out of range. Secret, hiding in scale powder technique. Fu used the same jutsu she had used on them earlier in the tunnels, exhaling a blindingly bright powder from her mouth. Reacting instinctively, Mayu screwed her eyes shut, running as fast as she could. Judging by the outraged howl of surprise from the Genin, he hadn't fared as well. When Mayu felt it safe enough to open her eyes again a few seconds later, sure enough, he was already slumped on the ground. She watched as Fu straightened over his body. Casually, the green-haired girl stretched her arms back behind her body, reminding her for some odd reason of an insect extending its scaly wings. Then, just as casually, Fu looked directly over at where Mayu stood. Here I come, she said brightly, pointing her finger in her direction. Mayu froze, her eyes widening. Unable to move, she watched as Fu took a deliberate slow step towards her. It was just her and the monster again. The monster took another step towards her. And then another. And another. Mayu couldn't move. All she could do was stand there, watching the sand below the monster's sandals billow in all directions with every step closer to her. Another step. The pause between each step was growing shorter. Step. Step. The monster would be here soon. Move, she tried to scream at herself. Move, or you'll die. Mayu whimpered, but she couldn't move. There was a glass tunnel, long and narrow, that was trapping her therein with the monster. She couldn't move nor breathe. The only way to move was forward, where the monster was waiting. The monster was close now. The monster was raising her hands. The corners of her mouth were turning upwards, and she could see a glimpse of sharp, glinting teeth. I'm scared. Mayu's lips cracked open. She wanted to cry out for help. Where were her teammates? Her gaze searchingly flicked sideways to the jeering audience. But she couldn't see anyone she recognized. It was a sea of blank faces. I'm so scared. The monster had taken out a kunai now. But she still couldn't move. All she could do was watch the kunai, so reminiscent of a fang, make its way towards her in a slow, downward arc. I'm scared. Mayu, a voice bellowed, cutting through the haze. As though she'd been splashed in ice-cold water, Mayu jerked in surprise and finding she could move again, just barely managed to throw herself out of the way. As soon as she hit the ground, Mayu somersaulted back onto her feet, pulling a kunai out of her pouch and holding it above her with a shaking hand. Fu looked at her with a bemused expression, and in the moment of stillness, Mayu glanced back at the spectators again. She found Rai immediately. His face was stark white as he stared back at her, the thick scar on his cheek standing out prominently. Naruto and Kakashi-sensei were gone, and somehow, she knew that Naruto must have collapsed again. The memory of finding him unconscious in his room several days ago suddenly flashed through her mind. She had been scared then too. Are you always this scared when your teammates aren't around? The girl asked, casually tossing the kunai around in her hands. Her orange eyes flashed dangerously, and her smile grew a little more strained. Or do you know what I am? To her surprise, Mayu found herself opening her mouth to speak. I'm always scared, she replied in an unexpectedly calm voice. I've been scared of everything for years. Fu cocked her head. What kind of way to live is that? Mayu's grip on her kunai tightened painfully. It's no way to live, she said, and threw the kunai. Fu jerked back, but the kunai never even went near her. Instead, it pierced through the air with a shattering sound before landing harmlessly on the ground at the other side of the arena. I'm scared but I'm tired of being scared. Naruto, what's wrong? Kakashi asked, watching in alarm as the Genin's face turned an ashen gray. Naruto stumbled. Reacting instinctively, Kakashi caught him before he fell. "Sensei, my head." Naruto's eyes rolled back, and his body went limp in Kakashi's arms. His free eye widened in shock. "Naruto?" Rai was finally back. Looking worried, he raced forward to help, but stopped in his tracks at Kakashi's expression. "No, it couldn't be," Kakashi murmured to himself, shaking his head. He anxiously stared down at Naruto's slack face. Over the years, as he watched the boy grow up from afar, he'd sometimes had his doubts and wondered about its possibility before. Even just today, he had felt uneasy when he heard about Naruto's recent sudden illness. After some contemplation, however, he dismissed it all as simple paranoia. But just now, the boy had fainted as soon as he broached the subject. This wasn't some psychological issue, it went far beyond that. This was an external cause. And it sounded very similar to the effects of something he'd once been very familiar with during the war. "It couldn't be," he repeated miserably. "That couldn't be what he meant." "What are you talking about, sensei?" Rai said, sounding upset. "What's wrong with Naruto? Is he sick again?" Kakashi straightened up, lifting up Naruto in his arms. "I'm going to take Naruto to a medic, Rai. I want you to stay here to cheer Mayu on," he said quietly. "But when I come back, I want you to tell me everything you know about Jinchuriki." Many miles away in the Fire Country, the venerable third Hokage Hiruzen Sarutobi looked outside at the setting sun from his office, his trusty pipe smoking in his hand. He hummed, watching the last rays strike the familiar busts of the past Hokage. The days were growing longer as spring approached, and he was glad. The past winter had been a long and severe one. His thoughts turned toward the Chunin exams that were currently taking place in Sunagakure. Several of Konoha's promising genins were participating this year, including Gai's rookies. Hiruzen was quite looking forward to seeing how they would be performing, particularly the Hyuga genius. There hadn't been a user of the Byakugan with as much promise in so many years. It was just a pity that he was from the branch house. Unless the main house changed their ways, then the boy's talents would never be used to their full extent. Knowing Gai's way of instructing his students with the greatest care, however, Hiruzen hadn't expected them to participate this year. He smiled, his temples wrinkling. It was probably because Kakashi, Gai's greatest rival, had entered his team in the exams this year. And on Kakashi's team was Hiruzen stilled. The smile faded, and he turned away from the window. He couldn't bear to look out and see Minato's face staring accusingly back at him. Sitting down at his desk, Hiruzen steepled his hands together. Every day, he wondered if he had made the right choice. Granted, it had been the only choice at the time. Such was the way of fate. And yet, he wondered, was fate really such an unmovable force? 11 years ago. And then 5 years ago. Hokage-sama. A silver-haired Anbu stumbled into the Hokage's office. There were several Chunin standing in front of the Hokage, but ignoring protocol, he ripped off his animal mask to reveal his face. "Dog," Hiruzen admonished. The Chunin beside him immediately averted their eyes. Hiruzen signaled for the Chunin to leave before turning to face the upset young ninja standing before him. "What is the matter? Is it true?" Kakashi demanded, once all of the Chunin had filed out of the room. "That the Nine Tails attacked? And that there were casualties?" "Yes," said the elder shinobi heavily. "But how?" Hiruzen raised his hand. "Now is not the time. It will all be explained soon. For now, know that it has been subjugated and resealed back in its host." Kakashi's eyes narrowed. "And what have you done with him?" The boy was understandably distraught when he reached consciousness. "For now he's been put to sleep, while the counselors and I discuss what to do with him." "It's true then," said Kakashi quietly. "That the council wants him dead?" "There have been some suggestions concerning different ways of quelling the host." Kakashi slammed the wall with his fist. "Naruto's still just a child. You can't blame him for something like this." "And I don't," said Hiruzen gently. "You need not worry for him. He has been put under high security guard to prevent anything from happening to him." "More like you're putting him under guard so to make people feel more at ease," Kakashi muttered. "Even though the Nine Tails has been resealed, he is still a danger, Kakashi." Hiruzen shook his head wearily. "Especially with the state his mind is currently in, most likely, he and the other witnesses will have to have their minds wiped of the memory. And then? The boy turns 6 tomorrow, yes," said Hiruzen, clasping his hands behind his back. He turned to Kakashi. "I think it is about time he has begun to be trained. He will be placed back in his apartment by tomorrow morning, with no memory of today's events. Could you bring him to my office then?" Kakashi numbly nodded. He didn't seem altogether pleased, but he seemed reassured that the Hokage had not given into village pressure and dealt with his teacher's son much more harshly. Turning around, the Anvil left without another word. Hiruzen sighed as the door slammed shut. As upset as Kakashi already was, he hadn't thought it prudent to fully clue him in on everything that was to be done regarding the boy. He himself would have preferred any other possible alternate method. But it had been the only way to pacify the counselors while giving him as normal a childhood as possible. Such a potent seal, he murmured to himself. Minato would be furious to know his own creation would be used on his son. He looked down at his lined hands silently. He would do the deed himself. All the blame would be his. End of chapter 13.